EMP series, The Exodus, entry number 6. I show us about a mile out from the Vermont border, Chief, I announced to Carl. Okay, our turnoff should be just up ahead. Pull us over at that dirt road coming up. That should be the entrance to the trail, Carl said. As I rolled the bus off to the side of the road, Greg and Carl grabbed their rifles and a small rucksack filled with a few basic supplies and headed for the door. Carl turned back and kissed Abigail, who was following them down the aisle. Keep the girls safe, he told her as they stepped off the bus. Since Carl and Greg were both wanted by the military, we couldn't take any chances trying to get them through the border checkpoint. With all the supplies we were carrying, we weren't too happy about facing them ourselves. Under martial law, if they could seize any or all of our supplies, including the bus itself. In this area, currently, they were just checking IDs and letting people pass unencumbered if everything checked out. It seemed that the further removed we get from when the EMP first hit, the better things were getting. We're returning to some sense of new normality. In the days immediately following the attack, they would have surely seized everything we had and sent us off on foot, or worse, detain us and move us to a FEMA camp. I watched out the side window as Greg and Carl ascended the trailhead that led up to the main trail. Carl turned and gave a final wave to Abigail and the girls before disappearing around a bend in the trail. The plan was for the bus to get across the border into Vermont and pick them up. There was a trail that went right through a little town a couple miles up the road. We calculated it at about 15 to 20 miles on the trail. Greg wanted to get an early start and do it in one long day of hiking. Carl secretly wanted to do it in one day too, but purposely scheduled it for 2 days of hiking. Carl himself was fit, and he knew the New England sections of the AT were some seriously challenging terrain. He wasn't looking forward to doing the whole thing in one day, but was pretty confident that he could if he needed to. Then he thought about Greg, a man 20 years his senior. While he too was fit for his age, Carl knew the hike had to be broken into 2 days. As I watched them ascend the trail and fade away into the landscape, I couldn't help wish I was going with them, just a little bit. I guess it's because it's familiar, going out for days at a time to serve the various business interests of the MC. It was very familiar to me. I once sat in a snowbank on the side of a lonely stretch of road that overlooked the Poland-Ukraine border crossing. I waited for a man that Buddy Tanner desperately wanted the club to meet. All I had to do was wait for him to come along and create a chance meeting. All we knew about his schedule was that he crossed twice a week. Always different days and times. No real pattern. I waited there for 3 days and 2 nights, camped in that snowbank, waiting to meet a man that probably didn't want to be met. There was something about it, though. The adventure, I suppose. But there was more to it than that. Then, just like that, they were gone. It had to also mean something that Carl and Greg chose me to lead this group until we picked them back up. With all the young talent we had in our group, they trusted me with their wives and families, with all they owned in the world besides. It was a sobering moment, and the weight of it was not lost on me. We found a good spot to lay low and camp overnight. We would drive to the pickup spot a few miles past the border crossing tomorrow. A trip that was scheduled to take Carl and Greg 2 days. So we pulled into an old Vermont state park and found a nice spot to camp by a slow-moving river. As it turned out, Carl and Greg could have just stayed with us on the bus. The patrol at the border barely made eye contact with me as they waved us through the checkpoint, without even so much as a single word being exchanged between us. It was quite a different story the next day, though, as we headed through a small hamlet on the way to our rendezvous with Greg and Carl. As we approached the small town, we crossed a gorge on a bridge some 70 to 80 feet above. As we came off the bridge and rounded the corner in the road, we saw them. 2 old World War II era deuce and a half trucks. They were completely blocking the road that lay before us. Beyond the blockade on either side of the road were several smaller vehicles, 3 or 4 old Willys Jeeps and an old power wagon. It looked similar to the one we had at the church back in Connecticut. That made me think of Steve. I hadn't been with the group long enough to forge any real bonds with anyone. I know that Steve and Richie and Tim had been preppers prior to the EMP attack. We had a member of the MC that was also into preparedness. He had been storing beans and rice in 5-gallon pails and firearms and ammo. He had medical supplies and vegetable seeds stored up to start a big garden. We all made fun of him and laughed at what we thought was borderline mental illness. After the attack, he disappeared, as he always said he would. He had tried for years to get us on board with prepping, saying, "You'll be sorry when the time comes. Laugh now, but when you're all caught with nothing and have to fight for every morsel of food and a means to survive, you'll all be sorry you laughed at me." I looked over at where Tim and Richie were sitting. They both lost a very dear friend when Steve was killed, a man who was like a brother to them. Richie had also lost his future son-in-law when Jerry was killed on daily patrol, back in the days immediately following the attack. They had both also lost other friends and church family members in the months that followed, as almost everyone here has. It was amazing how quickly society broke down after the attack. It was only a matter of weeks, days even, until people started killing each other to get what they needed to survive. It was still unthinkable to me that in a world where we could build a space station in outer space or develop a virtual net around the country under the water in the oceans, a man or woman sitting at a council in Norfolk, Virginia could detect a vessel leaving the coast of Russia and know what kind of vessel, how big, and even tell how much power the engines were producing and how fast it was traveling. It was unbelievable to me that with all this technology that we developed and maintained, that we could not harden our systems and infrastructure against a simple EMP attack. Some members of Congress had been beating the drum to make that a priority for years, but it either fell on deaf ears or the other members of the Senate and House of Representatives agreed that something should be done, but never seemed to be able to get enough support to get the funding for the various initiatives to achieve that goal. 2 armed soldiers with rifles slung at the low-ready position stepped away from the truck blockade and walked toward us as we approached. One of them held out his hand for us to stop. They boarded the bus and one of the soldiers stood in the front by the river and watched as the other walked down the aisle, pausing to study each face as he passed them. As he stepped past me, I could see clearly 2 pictures affixed to the clipboard he was holding. They were pictures of Carl and Greg. When he had walked down the aisle and back up, he stopped in front, next to his partner, and looked at me as I sat in the seat behind the driver. "You," he said sternly, "you in charge here?" I paused before answering and asked, "In charge? What makes you think anybody's in charge? We're just a group of refugees, displaced from our homes and fleeing the unrest of the region we were in." Which in all actuality was the truth. Well, part of it anyway. Then he asked me what region that was. After answering a series of questions and waiting for over an hour as he checked our ID papers, the guard returned to join his partner, who stayed with us on the bus. "Okay, we're going to need you to pull this rig off over there," as he pointed to a dirt parking area on the left. "Then shut the engine off, and one by one file off the bus and walk over and stand by that fence over there." He pointed to the fence that ran parallel to the cliff that overlooked the gorge. I had only a split second to think and make a decision. I looked in the mirror at the group, specifically at the children. Both soldiers were within arm's reach of me, and I was certain I could take the one by the door out quickly enough without any issues. I figured I had about a 50-50 chance of getting the second soldier before he gunned me down. As I looked at him, I saw Emily, the ex-soldier who decided to join us when we bugged out, sitting in the seat directly to his side. She casually nodded to me as if to let me know that she knew what I was thinking and was on board with it. It made me feel a little more confident that, with her help, we could easily take out both men. Then I glanced up into the mirror and looked back at the group. I saw the children again. Innocent children. How could I allow them to see us kill these soldiers right here in front of them? Then I thought of the potential outcomes for them and for all of us if we simply complied and gave up. I decided that under no circumstances could I surrender the group to the fate of these troops. Just then, a half-dozen soldiers emerged onto the road and formed a line to direct us over to the side. All this developed within a minute's time, and any hesitation on my part could be a fatal mistake. I slowly started to drive the bus over to where we were directed. As I pulled off the road onto the dirt lot, I saw my opportunity. There was a spot barely wide enough for the bus to fit through, between the end of the deuce and a half and the fence separating us from the cliffs. "There it is, Chief," Emily blurted out, obviously seeing the opportunity as well. The guard looked down at her and said, "What? What are you talking about?" he demanded. She said nothing. Back over the border, up in the woods on the New York side of the line, the black German shepherd sat patiently and quietly in the back of the excursion. The radio crackled, and the dog's master and handler, seated in the driver's seat, picked up the mic when he heard the voice of his team member on the other end. "Go ahead, Lima 5, he responded. "Chief, we got a possible situation here." He filled the man in on what he was observing and asked, "What are our orders, Chief?" The man seated in the excursion thought for a moment about his options. Why do I put us in these situations? Alls we had to do was keep to ourselves, mind our own business, and protect our small, insignificant piece of turf, he thought to himself. Then he keyed the mic. "What about an egress plan?" he asked. The voice on the other end assured him it was solid. He was certain they could escape and get away before they even knew they were there. They were on dirt bikes and could stay off the main roads and return undetected. "Okay," said the man in the excursion. "You have a green light to engage." Repeat, green light to engage at your discretion. "Roger that, Chief. Lima 5 clear," came the response. Now that I knew Emily was on the same page with what we needed to do, I gunned the bus at the same time I drew the .45 Greg kept on the side of his seat between him and the bus wall. I fired one shot, hitting the guard in the head. I quickly started to turn to line up on the leader when he fell to the floor. The knife that Emily had used to puncture his jugular vein still sticking in his neck. She had stood up quickly behind him, slipped it in. He was dead before he hit the ground. The kids started to scream hysterically as the mothers attempted to shelter and console them. to calm them down. A feeling came over me, a bad feeling. What would this sight do to these children going forward? It could take years for them to recover, if they ever truly would. Then I thought, yes, years that they might not even have had I not done anything to get us out of here. I knew I had done the right thing, as hard as the consequences of it would be. The only real thing I could see to do. Still, that feeling was there. We took part of the fence down as we attempted to squeeze the 8-foot wide bus through the 7-foot wide opening. There was a small truck ahead off to the side of the road directly behind and to the side of the blockade. Mounted on the back of it was what looked to be a .50 caliber machine gun. The gunner fired the first burst, which was shortened when he slumped forward dead in the turret. Most of our gear was stacked in the rear of the bus, and so as the soldiers on foot shot at us as we fled, we could hear the bullets hitting the back of the bus, but none made it through. While the initial burst of the machine gun fire was cut short, it did rip through the left side of the bus, sending window glass shards flying everywhere. One round came through the sidewall just below the window and narrowly missed the group member seated there. As I looked through the side view mirror, I saw a soldier step out behind us with a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher and prepare to fire. As he stood there behind us, I watched as he too fell dead to the ground. I didn't know who or how or why this was happening, but I wasn't about to question it. I looked up and smiled. I remembered God's promise to his people that he would never leave or forsake us. Our God truly is a good God. I floored the accelerator and raced down the road. I heard a huge explosion and I felt its concussion as I looked in the mirror to see one of the trucks fully engulfed in flames. I saw several soldiers firing rifles into the tree line on the left. Then something hit the second truck, and it too was burning. "Everybody okay?" I shouted as I looked in the mirror at the group. After a brief pause, Abigail yelled back, "Everyone's okay." I smiled again as I sped down the road. Looking back at the chaos, I saw that nobody was following us.